No one believed a poor mechanic could fix the unfixable machine. But when he did, the CEO gave him more than just a contract. She gave him her heart. Like, share, and subscribe. No matter where you're from, this story will touch your heart. Let's get started. Inside the massive factory, chaos echoed off steel walls and machinery. Sparks flew where frantic technicians attempted repairs, and the smell of overheated wires filled the air. The million-dollar machine, the pride of the company, stood still. Its silence was more terrifying than its usual roar. Workers whispered nervously, knowing every passing second meant mounting losses. At the center of it all stood the CEO, a sharp 40-year-old woman with piercing eyes and an air of authority. She crossed her arms, frustration evident. "If this machine isn't fixed soon, we'll lose everything," she declared, her voice trembling with restrained fury. The factory had been her empire, built over decades, and this particular machine was its crown jewel. Without it, production would halt, contracts would collapse, and the reputation she fought to build would crumble. Teams of engineers had tried their best. Each one came forward with confidence, but walked away defeated. The machine was a labyrinth of circuits, gears, and systems beyond ordinary skill. Her company's future was slipping through her fingers, and her staff looked to her helplessly, waiting for answers she didn't have. Every failure tightened the knot of tension in the room. Among the dozens gathered, a man stood apart from the crowd, a 35-year-old mechanic named Daniel. He wasn't in a polished suit or a lab coat, but in a worn-out shirt stained with oil, his boots scuffed from years of hard labor. He was a single dad, known in town as humble and hard-working, but in this factory he was just another lowly repairman. He had no degrees, no prestigious background, only hands that knew the language of machines better than words. He stayed quiet, listening, but inside him stirred an unusual confidence. The CEO's eyes swept across the room, sharp and demanding, seeking someone brave enough to step forward. For a moment, silence dominated. Then Daniel shifted slightly, raising his hand. The crowd turned, some with curiosity, others with mockery already forming in their smirks. He wasn't part of the elite engineering team, just a hired mechanic called when simple jobs were needed. His courage felt out of place in that moment, like a whisper in a storm. But he took a step forward anyway, his voice calm yet steady. "I can try fixing it." The CEO arched an eyebrow, intrigued but skeptical. She measured him with a glance, his worn boots, tired eyes, and calloused hands. To her, he seemed more like a man who fixed tractors in dusty fields than someone who could restore a million-dollar machine. Still, the absurdity of the situation tugged at her frustration, and she let out a sharp laugh. Half in jest, half to challenge his nerve, she smirked and said, "If you fix this engine, I'll marry you." The words dropped like a spark in dry grass, igniting the crowd's laughter instantly. Laughter spread through the room like wildfire. Engineers chuckled, some shook their heads, and a few outright jeered. "Did you hear that? The mechanic fixing what we couldn't?" one scoffed. "Might as well let a farmer solve it," another whispered. To them, Daniel's attempt was ridiculous, an impossible dream that didn't deserve respect. The CEO herself didn't expect him to succeed. She had spoken out of sarcasm and fatigue, but Daniel didn't flinch. His eyes locked on the machine, and instead of the ridicule around him, he saw only the challenge calling to his hands and mind. Daniel had always lived in the shadows of doubt. As a single dad, every job he took was about survival, feeding his daughter, keeping a roof over their heads. He wasn't used to applause or recognition, but he knew machines like old friends. Where others saw tangled wires and dead ends, he saw patterns, possibilities, and hidden logic. He didn't need fancy tools or degrees. He needed focus. The jeers didn't matter. The CEO's smirk didn't matter. The machine, silent and waiting, was the only voice he chose to hear in that noisy hall. Slowly, he approached the massive machine. Its steel frame loomed over him, casting a shadow that seemed almost alive. He placed a hand on the cold metal, closing his eyes for a second as if listening. Behind him, murmurs and laughter buzzed like hornets, but Daniel shut them out. He crouched, examined the wiring, traced the gears with his eyes, and noticed details others had overlooked. "You've been hurt before," he whispered softly, almost as if the machine were a wounded creature. His hands moved with instinct, mapping its secrets, the way only years of grease and toil could teach. The CEO leaned back, half amused, half impatient. Part of her wanted to dismiss him outright, to tell him to step away before he embarrassed himself. Yet something in his composure stopped her. He wasn't fumbling like the engineers had. He was deliberate, calm, methodical. A flicker of doubt passed through her, doubt in her own assumption. Could this mechanic truly see something the experts had missed? The crowd, still laughing, didn't notice the slight shift in her expression. For the first time she felt a spark of curiosity burn through her frustration. The factory's chaos grew quiet, almost eerily so, as Daniel prepared to attempt the impossible. The laughter still echoed faintly, but now there was an undercurrent of tension, like the hush before a storm. The machine sat there, lifeless yet powerful, and the man everyone dismissed was about to challenge it. His daughter's face flashed in his mind, her trust, her hope, her belief that her father could do anything. He inhaled deeply, wiped his hands on his shirt, and leaned closer to the heart of the broken beast. The test of his life was about to begin. The mechanic didn't laugh at the joke. Instead, he walked closer to the broken machine, his boots echoing across the cold factory floor. While others had thrown up their hands in defeat, he placed his palm gently on the steel, almost as if he could feel its heartbeat. He didn't see just a machine. He saw a puzzle waiting to be solved. The engineers rolled their eyes. The CEO raised a brow, curious but skeptical. To her, he was just a single dad mechanic, someone who patched up cars, not million-dollar machines. Still, he began his work quietly, undeterred. He studied every gear, every pipe, every wire with eyes sharpened by years of hardship. His hands, rough from countless late nights fixing old engines in dimly lit garages, moved with patience. He didn't rush. Where others had measured by equations, he listened to the hum of the machine's silence. At night, when everyone else left, he stayed, crawling under panels, sketching diagrams on scraps of paper, and whispering thoughts aloud. The machine wasn't just broken, it was misunderstood, and he was determined to understand it fully. Days blurred into nights, but his determination never faltered. His shirt clung with sweat, grime streaked across his face, yet his focus remained absolute. When exhaustion threatened to consume him, he remembered the promise of stability for his daughter, the reason he woke up every day. Failure wasn't an option. The CEO sometimes came to check on him, arms folded, pretending not to care. But she noticed something the others lacked in him: humility mixed with relentless drive. He didn't demand recognition, didn't ask for help. He simply worked. One afternoon, his little daughter skipped into the factory, carrying a small paper bag of sandwiches. She was only 8, with eyes that shone brighter than any spark. "You can do it, Dad," she whispered, handing him the food. Her voice was soft but firm, like a secret promise between them. He smiled, the fatigue easing from his shoulders. That encouragement was worth more than any paycheck, more than any title. With her tiny hands brushing away grease from his cheek, he felt his resolve burn hotter than before. The engineers mocked him at first, whispering among themselves, "A mechanic? Fixing this? Impossible." Some laughed openly, calling his efforts a waste of time. But as the days stretched on, their laughter quieted. They began peeking over his shoulder, curiosity replacing arrogance. He was doing something no one else had dared, taking the machine apart, not just physically but in his mind. He mapped its flaws like a doctor diagnosing a patient. Slowly, Their smirks faded into stunned silence, replaced by awe. Even the harshest critics leaned closer to see his progress. Piece by piece, the stubborn machine began to respond. A lever that had refused to move for weeks suddenly shifted under his touch. A gear that had been frozen sparked to life after he adjusted its alignment. The sound of metal responding rang through the factory like music. The first time it emitted a faint hum, every eye turned. Engineers who had once sneered were now taking notes, whispering nervously as though watching a miracle. The CEO, despite herself, leaned forward, her heart racing. She had not expected this. The factory became a stage, and he, the quiet performer. Each movement of his hands drew more attention. At night, when he wiped sweat from his brow and tightened the last bolts, the factory lights seemed to glow brighter. It wasn't just a man repairing a machine. It was a father fighting for a future, a man defying the odds. His daughter often sat nearby, swinging her legs and humming songs, filling the silence with warmth. She watched proudly, knowing her dad wasn't just fixing an engine. He was proving to the world what he was capable of. The CEO tried to hide her shifting emotions. At first, she had seen him as nothing more than a pawn, a man to mock with a careless dare. Yet now, every spark that flew from the machine felt like a spark in her chest. She admired his persistence, his refusal to give up when all the experts had walked away. She caught herself staying longer in the factory, watching him with a mix of admiration and something else she couldn't name. For the first time, she believed that maybe he could actually succeed. Then one evening, after nearly collapsing from exhaustion, he tightened the last valve and pressed a switch. At first, silence. Then with a sudden jolt, the machine roared. Gears spun, pistons pumped, and the massive engine, thought dead by all, came alive with thunderous energy. The entire factory shook with its awakening. Engineers gasped, mouths open in disbelief. The CEO froze, eyes wide, her smirk replaced with wonder. His daughter clapped, squealing, "Dad, you did it!" In that moment, he wasn't just a mechanic. He was the man who accomplished the impossible. The night was heavy with silence as the mechanic stood before the giant machine one last time. His hands were blistered, his shirt soaked with grease, but his eyes carried the fire of a man who refused defeat. Around him, engineers and workers gathered, half curious, half skeptical. Even the CEO, usually surrounded by advisors and assistants, was there, arms folded, gaze sharp, masking the nervous hope buried deep inside her. He bent down, adjusted the final bolt, and whispered to himself, "For her, for us." With trembling fingers, he pressed the switch. The machine shuddered at first, coughing like an old beast waking from a long slumber. The sound echoed through the entire factory floor. For a breathless second, everyone thought it would collapse again. But then, like thunder splitting the night sky, the engine roared to life, a deep, steady growl that grew stronger, smoother, until it purred like perfection itself. Lights flashed, belts turned, gears spun. The million-dollar system that had been declared unfixable was reborn before their very eyes. The crowd erupted. Applause, whistles, shouts of joy filled the vast hall. Workers who had doubted him were now cheering his name. Even the engineers, once mocking him, stood frozen in awe, unable to believe what they had witnessed. The mechanic straightened up slowly, wiping the sweat and oil from his face, his chest heaving with exhaustion and triumph. The CEO, her heels clicking against the floor, walked forward. She was a woman used to power, used to keeping her emotions hidden. But as she stood face to face with the man who had just achieved the impossible, her composure cracked. Her lips curved into a proud, almost tender smile. You did it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You actually did it." He gave a tired smile, his eyes still burning with determination. "You said it couldn't be done, but I don't believe in impossible." She swallowed hard, her earlier words ringing in her ears. "If you can fix this, I'll marry you myself." At the time, it had been a taunt, a way to put him in his place, to silence the laughter of her board members. But now she realized it was a promise, and she was not a woman who broke promises. The factory quieted as she reached for his hand. The touch was firm, yet gentle, the kind that carried both respect and something more. Looking around at her employees, she declared, "He fixed what the world said was unfixable. He's not just a mechanic. He's a man of vision, of courage, and I am a woman of my word." Whispers ran through the crowd, disbelief spreading like wildfire. Could she really mean it? Was she truly going to honor her bold challenge? Days turned into weeks, and the whispers turned into invitations. Golden envelopes were sent to every worker, every engineer, every board member who had once laughed. The factory, once a place of sweat and machinery, buzzed now with talk of flowers, music, and vows. When the wedding day arrived, the contrast could not have been sharper. The mechanic, dressed in a suit that still felt foreign on his rugged frame, stood nervously at the altar. He had spent his life with engines and tools, not tuxedos and ceremonies. But when he saw her, walking down the aisle in a gown that shimmered like starlight, his doubts melted away. The CEO, the woman who once ruled boardrooms with iron resolve, now looked at him with softness in her eyes that no one had ever seen before. Every step she took was not just toward him, but away from the world of pride and arrogance she had once lived in. The vows were simple, yet powerful. She promised to stand by him, not above him. He promised to love her, not just for her power, but for the heart he had discovered beneath it. When they kissed, the room erupted with claps, cheers, and even tears. The workers who had once mocked him now raised their glasses high, celebrating a union no one could have imagined. But the story did not end with the wedding. Their partnership became something more than love. It became legacy. Together, they ran the factory, combining his raw skill and her strategic vision. Where she brought innovation, he brought practicality. Where she sought perfection, he reminded her of humanity. Under their joint leadership, the factory grew into one of the most respected names in the industry. Workers were no longer treated as mere hands, but as family. Apprenticeships were started for poor kids who had no chance at education, inspired by the mechanic's humble beginnings. And every time the massive engine roared to life, people remembered the day it had been saved. Not by experts in expensive suits, but by a man who refused to give up. Years later, when their daughter, born from a love story that began as a joke, stood beside the same machine, she listened to her father's story. He knelt down, handed her a small wrench and said, "Remember, impossible is just a word. What matters is how hard you're willing to try." The little girl smiled, holding the tool like a treasure. The CEO, now softer but still radiant, stood beside them, her hand resting on her husband's shoulder. Together, they had built not just a family or a business, but a legend. And it all began the day a poor mechanic dared to take on the impossible and won both an engine's life and a CEO's heart.